Chapter 3 in Drug Trafficking, Organized Crime, and Violence in the Americas Today focuses on the war on drugs and the role of SOCOM. This presentation will focus on the past, present, and future that the role of SOCOM has on the war of drugs. In 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs to combat the rise of heroin and marijuana consumption inside the United States. By then, drug use in the United States was becoming an epidemic, so President Nixon had to do things to combat this epidemic, which he used the military, namely SOCOM, to help uh, combat the flow of illegal drugs coming inside the United States from Mexico and Colombia. Mexico and Colombia mainly were also against the drug trade, but that didn't stop their countrymen from producing and distributing uh, the drugs inside the United States and all across the world. But these Latin countries did put up a fight against the drugs by using tactics like dismantling the drug trafficking organizations, extradition from their country to the United States for those criminals couldn't face criminal charges, and criminalization of the entire internal chain related to the drug business. So people who even had a small role were also um, punished for their roles in that drug organization. One of the main tactics used in Latin America was the crop eradication program. So South American countries tried to eradicate the drug crops, which was the coca leaves and the marijuana plants, with poisonous drugs that were deployed from planes flying over the crops, like basically like crop dusters. But it was ineffective because it didn't damage that much of the crop because they were making so much product. It only damaged maybe a few, so it became non-effective. So when the crop eradication program became uh, non-effective, they went to another tactic, which was using the military. And most countries used the military except for like Argentina and Chile. There were a few that didn't use the military, but most of the countries did. So in the 80s, in the United States and in those Latin American countries, the war on drugs became a national security issue because they were getting the drug issue was getting so out of hand. So even with all the good that these countries try to do by using the military, it also had a negative effect on their civilian population because it had negative effects on the civilian slash military relations and human rights abuse and corruption levels because in some Latin countries, their military leaders were also part of the drug trade. So fast forward into the mid to late 90s, after Colombia was reigning as the drug kingpins of the world, or at least of Latin America's, was coming to an end. Mexico started to take over and become a major drug trafficking country. So it was said that Mexico drug traffickers quote lack infrastructure and organizational capabilities necessary to exercise operations at the international scale independently. So they basically people didn't see Mexico as a solid threat to become a drug powerhouse like they have become today. So as time goes on and they become a larger and larger player in the drug trade, in 2010, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said Mexico was, quote, looking more and more like Colombia looked 20 years ago, which uh, in the drug trade is a pretty great compliment because Colombia, as we all know, dominated the marijuana and cocaine trade in the mid to late 80s. So during Mexico's takeover, the term Colombianization began to be used to basically compare the rise of Mexico's drug trade organizations to that of Colombia. So Mexican organized crime also began to adapt and begin to expand more to the United States, Europe, and mainly to Europe, where the demand for drugs was growing. So obviously, since Mexico is so close to America, America had to get involved. So in 2010, many politicians, military representatives, and experts deemed Mexico a failed state due to its incapacity to govern and abuse of political will. Basically, in Mexico, the drug trade started to overwhelm the government officials, and basically, drug lords and drug kingpins started to run the government there. And so, if you have corrupt politicians, obviously you can't govern well. So that's why they deem Mexico a failed state. So Washington officials seeing Mexico state as a threat to the U.S. national security and decided to intervene. So obviously they wanted to help Mexico with their intervening, but it didn't lead to a better state for Mexico. Um, you take Colombia and Afghanistan, who one Colombia was kings of the cocaine production in Afghanistan, who is one of the leaders in the opium and heroin production, have both been deemed failed states, and even after America deployed both funds and troops to both countries, no substantial progress was made in either one of those countries. Now, many people don't know that the U.S. has been involved in the war on drugs since President Nixon first declared it, but their involvement has been minimal because of the Passe Comitatus Act of 1878, which stated troops could not be used for domestic law enforcement. But in 1986, President Reagan sent part of the 193rd Infantry Brigade and six Black Hawks to Bolivia to locate and destroy cocaine laboratories. So he found a way around that to try to combat. So from November of 1990 to October 1993, SOUTHCOM, which stands for Southern Command, which is a U.S. Army division, was commanded by General George Owen, who was an important figure in expanding the military's counter-drug mission. So Southcom needed and they received an increasing area capability to detect and intercept potential drug flights because back then Latin countries would have planes fly over the United States and drop drug uh, packages onto U.S. soil for them to be picked up and distributed throughout the country. So with the increased aerial capabilities, uh, U.S. Southcom was able to detect more of those flights and prosecute those people who were bringing the drugs in. Now, as far as the presence of Southcom in Latin America, that isn't ending anytime soon because the war on drugs in the United States and in Latin countries isn't ending anytime soon. So Southcom has assumed a leadership role in the ongoing fight against drugs and won't relinquish that title until the fight is done. So you can expect to see a military presence, maybe small or big, in the near future in Latin countries. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.